So far, 2012 has been a year of solemn anniversaries. In January, we marked 10 years since the Guantanamo Bay detention facility was first opened as part of Bush's so-called war on terror. In February, British resident Shakar Ahmad spent his 10th year in prison, while March saw the 9th anniversary of the disappearances of Pakistani neuroscientist Afia Siddiqui and her 3 children. Well, earlier this week, May 1st marked a decade since Faiz al-Kandari was brought to the controversial detention center in Cuba. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Absent Justice with me, Muazzam Beg. Faiz al-Kandari, a Kuwaiti citizen, has been in detainee in Guantanamo since 2002 after being captured by Pakistani forces and sold into US custody. Despite over 400 interrogations, hours of torture, beatings and sleep deprivation, the US government has failed to produce evidence to charge him with any wrongdoing. So why does he remain in Guantanamo, indefinitely detained? Before we discuss this question and more, here's a report from Houria Al-Haddad.
36-year-old Faiz al-Kandari is one of 2 Kuwaiti citizens who remain behind bars at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center in Cuba. This week marked the 10th year of his detention at the infamous prison since his arrival on May 1, 2002. But after a decade of broken promises and delayed judicial process, campaigners say Faiz is still nowhere closer to justice. Faiz visited Afghanistan as a humanitarian aid worker in August 2001, but was then caught up in the chaos following the 9/11 attacks and the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, which was launched 2 months after he arrived in the country. As he tried to make his way into Pakistan to avoid the violence, he was seized by Afghan forces and handed over to US soldiers, who eventually transferred him to Guantanamo, where he was subjected to a program of torture, beatings and sexual humiliation. The United States government has never charged Faiz in any court with wrongdoing. Under the Bush administration, he was referred to a military commission for trial, but charges have never been filed. Despite the unreliability of the allegations against Faiz, he remains in Guantanamo indefinitely detained, having had his habeas corpus petition denied over a year ago. Now his lawyers and supporters are calling for Faiz to be returned back to Kuwait, where his family is waiting to help him readjust to normal life after his extraordinary decade-long ordeal.
Well, to discuss this case, I am very pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Commander Kevin Boguki and Lieutenant Colonel Barry Wingard, the military defence lawyers for Faiz al-Kandari. I'd like to ask you first, Colonel Wingard, what first brought you into contact with the case of Faiz al-Kandari and generally the Kuwaitis in particular?
Well, let me start by thanking you for having us here. I represent Faiz al-Kandari. I came to the military commissions in 2008, and I came here as a prosecutor formerly for the military. So after 28 years in the military, I volunteered to come to the military commissions when I first came into contact with Faiz al-Kandari. Faiz al-Kandari is a Kuwaiti who's been held since 2002 without charge. Immediately upon coming to the military commissions, at the end of the Bush administration, there were several cases that were put into the military commission. One of those cases was Faiz. So my first experience with Faiz was one of in disbelief. I believe that probably having not met him, that he probably had done something and that it was up to me to probably figure out a way to negotiate some sort of plea on his behalf. But I can tell you, after having met with him more than 50 times, I mean, his story is quite clear. It's very factually easy. In 2001, Faiz went to Afghanistan to repair 2 wells and to repair a mosque, to build a well. In Afghanistan, the American bombing began, and during this time, there was a bounty offered for all Arabs that was in Afghanistan at the time. Faiz tried to get out of Afghanistan, but unfortunately he did not make it. Subsequently, he was sold to American forces. As an Arab who was in Afghanistan at the time, he was then transported to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So when I first met with him, I was in sort of disbelief, but having met with him, I'm here to tell you that I think that Guantanamo Bay is a catastrophe.
And I guess that at this time, now when so many hundreds of prisoners have been released, it's even harder to kind of countenance the idea that somebody could still be there for so long without charge or trial. But Colonel Boguki, I would like to just, if you could tell me, you've dealt with some of the people who were held and then released from Guantanamo. What was your experience of that process?
Absolutely, thank you. As a preliminary matter, while I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy and Colonel Wingard is a senior officer in the United States Air Force, we are not here speaking on behalf of the Pentagon or the United States military or even the United States. We've been assigned to represent Fayez al-Khandari, and that's what we do. It is a mission that we believe in with our hearts, and we are fighting for what we think are the best principles of American justice. Guantanamo has nothing to do with American justice. Guantanamo is a system that has been designed exclusively for foreign detainees, and a system of justice is in place, the military commission system, that is just fraught with unfairness, meant to secure prosecutions in cases that cannot otherwise be won. But stepping back now, in 2008, at the same time, on the same day that Colonel Wingard was assigned to represent Fayez al-Khandari, I was assigned as lead military counsel for another Kuwaiti detainee, Fawad al-Rabia. And Fawad al-Rabia ultimately spent 8 years at Guantanamo Bay for going to Afghanistan as a humanitarian relief worker. He took 2 weeks of leave from his job, and while he happened to be in Afghanistan, the United States attacked. He couldn't get out. He was eventually sold to United States forces and wound up in Guantanamo. 8 years later, when he finally got a trial, the judge realized the United States had no evidence against him. They had held this man in Guantanamo Bay for 8 years, calling him the worst of the worst, and there was no evidence against him. So she ordered his immediate release. And fortunately, alhamdulillah, he was returned to Kuwait at the end of 2009. And at that point, I was then assigned to assist Colonel Wingard in his representation of Fayez al-Khandari. The most important thing about Fawad al-Rabia, and the reason that I mention it, is they called him the worst of the worst. He was an innocent man. He is rock solid proof that there were and that there are innocent men at Guantanamo, and that truth will not come to light until they are all afforded due process.
Now, this is something extremely interesting. It's a recurrent story, of course, that we've all come across former Guantanamo prisoners who've returned to whichever corner of the world it is that they speak from, is that they were captured, sold for a bounty, and the rest is, as you say, history. But you've both been to Kuwait. Colonel Wingard, you've met with Fayez several times, and I believe developed a good relationship with your client. What sort of reception do you get from former prisoners when you go there, and how do they view you in terms of being somebody from the US military who's defending their former co-detainee?
Well, my first encounters with Fayez, obviously, they were awkward. I mean, I wear the uniform of the people who interrogated him in enhanced ways over 400 times. So we started off suspicious of each other, actually. But over time, I mean, we've written hundreds of articles on his behalf. We've done a lot of press on his behalf. I mean, we want the world to know how unjust this system is. I mean, the fact that you can keep somebody for 10 years in an animal cage in an offshore prison without even offering them the opportunity to prove their innocence is not only completely against American principles, but it's against humanitarian principles. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is, in Guantanamo Bay, it held 779 men, as you fully are aware of. Of those 779, over 600 have been released without trial. Now, the government promises us that if they can get the military commission system, which is an inherently unfair system, if they can get the benefit, they can prosecute up to 40 people. Now, I don't believe they're going to prosecute 40 people, but 40 people out of 779. But the tragedy is not even there. The tragedy, the real tragedy, is that 46 human beings, 46 men, are going to be held for the rest of their lives in indefinite detention without the opportunity to ever be able to step foot into a courtroom and to prove their innocence. I can tell you, having read Fayez's case, there is no evidence. The evidence is underwhelming, even with their military commission system that they want. So I can't conclude anything other than to conclude that Fayez will probably be one of those 46 men, along with his companion, Fawzi al-Lota, who's also a Kuwaiti, the two final Kuwaitis, will be indefinitely detained for the rest of his life without ever being able to step into a courtroom and prove his innocence. And that's a travesty.
The point that you're making is extremely relevant to the case of Shakar Amar, especially when we are talking about somebody who's not going to be facing a military commission, somebody who isn't charged per se. What is it, in your knowledge of Faiz as the individual, that makes him somebody that the United States is so reluctant to release? Is it something, as we've seen with Shakar, that he is a very profound character, he's a very charismatic character who has some influence because he's fighting and struggling for the rights of the others, or is there something else?
Well, let me tell you, Fayez has had many opportunities to make statements against others. In fact, he's been told that if you say certain things, you will really help your case as far as securing your release. Now, Fayez and Shakar know each other, and they do have a lot in common, and Fawzi al-Lota as well. They're articulate, they're people that are sought out for their advice, they're well-spoken by the other prisoners. I mean, one great example of this is the fact that in one of the proceedings with Fayez, he was accused of having initiated a fatwa against the chicken that's actually consumed in Guantanamo Bay. Now, Fayez, being the strong individual, when he tells people that you shouldn't eat the undercooked chicken, it's construed by those who house him that he's issued a fatwa against chicken.
You're telling me that he's issued a fatwa against a chicken or chickens, and as a result of this, he's actually...
Well, I don't think it's exclusive to American chicken. I think it's to chicken in general that's undercooked.
If it wasn't so terrible, this would be, of course, very laughable, and we have to restrain ourselves because of this. But Kuwait is the closest ally of the United States in the Middle East. It has a strong relationship, of course, because of what happened in Iraq and Operation Desert Shield and that history. What is it that's preventing the Kuwaiti government from seeking back their sons? And what progress have you made in this?
Colonel Wingard and I have traveled to Kuwait many times, 15 times. And in the course of those visits, we've met with many Kuwaiti officials. We've done many interviews in the Kuwaiti media. And we've managed to raise awareness of, first of all, the fact that there still are 2 Kuwaitis remaining in Guantanamo Bay, which when we first started, the majority of Kuwaitis weren't even aware of that fact. The Kuwaitis have spent a lot of money hiring attorneys that have pursued action on their behalf. And when you ask them what have they done to try to get their sons returned to Kuwait, the answer is, we spent a lot of money. But they hadn't done much else. The Kuwaitis tend to be a very polite people. And so rather than demanding the return of their sons, as the United States would do under identical circumstances, rather than demanding their return, the Kuwaitis tend to politely request their return. And over the course of our efforts in Kuwait, we've seen that the Kuwaitis have begun to voice those requests in more and more forceful ways, but they still haven't risen to the level of being willing to place any consequences upon the United States' refusal to return these 2 Kuwaiti citizens to probably the United States' strongest ally in the Gulf region.
Indeed, I remember seeing some video footage of some demonstrations, I think it was in November last, of senior Kuwaiti officials, Kuwaiti scholars, Islamic scholars. I know Nabil al-Audi, who's very known in the Arabic world as somebody who has his own television channel and somebody who pronounces his own religious ethics and so forth, that they all demonstrated outside the US Embassy in Kuwait, calling for the return of Faiz and Fawzi. What do you think has changed, made them change? What do you think has brought them to this point where they can feel now that we can fight for the rights of our citizens?
Well, our partner in Kuwait is an attorney named Abdul Adil Hadi. He's from the Alua law firm. He's a godsend. I mean, he is an amazing man. He's my hero. We first introduced this issue of Guantanamo Bay into Parliament for the first time in May of last year, into the Kuwait Parliament. Now, the Kuwait Parliament, it actually got into an altercation. That's how incendiary Guantanamo Bay is. It got into an altercation over who was doing more and who was doing less. This is May. This is the first time in Kuwait history that there has ever been a fight in Parliament, an actual physical fight.
This is the physical fight that you talk about that was televised, and everybody saw this, that individuals from the Kuwaiti Parliament were actually physically at one another's throats.
Exactly. And then, I mean, it gets even better than that. Now,
sorry, this was based on a question posed in Parliament about why our citizens from Guantanamo are not being returned?
Exactly. After 10 years, I mean, the Kuwaitis are really fond of saying, what would happen in the reverse? What would happen if we had 2 Americans who we interrogated in enhanced ways, we put them on an island prison off of Kuwait? What do we think the Americans would do? Would they be content after 10 years to have done nothing? So this evolved into a fight in May. Now, November comes around, and in November, you know, we saw some serious action. We saw more than 1,000 people turn up at the U.S. Embassy, and I mean, to express their discontent on everything that had been done. And I mean, it was the first time in Kuwait history that they had turned up in that kind of number to the U.S. Embassy.
It included several hundred women, it included Islamic scholars, it included members of the government and so forth.
It was an amazing assembly. But in February, what we saw is a newly convened parliament in Kuwait that had fought over the issue of Guantanamo Bay as to who could do more. In February of this year, signed a condemnation of the United States by a vote of 50-0. All 50 members of parliament demanded 5 things. One of those things was that their tortured sons should be returned immediately back to Kuwait. Now, they didn't ask for military commission trials in Cuba. They said that after 10 years, you forfeited your right to try these boys. Return them or try them in the Kuwait court system if you think you do have evidence. So it was a real step forward. I mean, we're really moving along. More demonstrations, more public concern. The emir, the Kuwait emir, issued a statement that he will not rest until his sons are returned, essentially. I mean, we were really seeing a lot of progress, but it's just unfortunate that it's not being reported in the media due to all the celebrity activity.
Now, there are some difficult points about the Kuwaiti returnees. One in particular went on to carry out an act of terrorism, and as a result of that, the United States government had asked for certain assurances. And of course, that mirrors some of the things that have happened in the UK in terms of security, the big question of if somebody's returned from Guantanamo and there's no charges against him, but they feel that there's some intelligence against him, they've asked for assurances. What sort of assurances has Kuwait given to the United States in terms of what they're ready to or what they have done?
You know, Kuwait, consistent with its love for America and its value of its relationship with America, has really gone above and beyond in its efforts to assure the United States that it will protect both its own national security and the national security of the United States. Every time the United States proposed a precondition for the return of the remaining Kuwaitis, Kuwait satisfied that condition. Ultimately, and each time Kuwait did that, the United States moved back the goal line and would impose yet another precondition and another precondition. Finally, the United States said to Kuwait, well, we're not comfortable that you can handle the detainees once they're returned because you don't have a rehabilitation center like Saudi Arabia. Kuwait immediately turned around and spent approximately $40 million constructing a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center with, 20-foot walls around it to demonstrate their commitment to security, but inside absolutely state-of-the-art facilities. They then staffed it with top professionals, imams, psychologists, psychiatrists, all meant to address the concerns of the United States and to ensure that the needs of these detainees will be appropriately met once they are returned to Kuwait. What happened? Immediately, the United States pushed back the goal line, made additional demands, made demands that ultimately Kuwait couldn't comply with and still be acting in accordance with Kuwaiti law. It's now come to a point where it's fairly clear that it doesn't matter what Kuwait does as far as these preconditions. The United States is just going to keep pushing back the goal line, and there will never be a condition that Kuwait can meet that will result in the return of Fayez and Fawzi to Kuwait. The only way to do it is to demand the return of these citizens of Kuwait to their home country the same way that the United States would demand the return of Americans held abroad under identical circumstances.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so it's been a great pleasure having you both on the show. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this week. I remember when I saw Fayez last, he came and said to the prisoners, Al-Faraj Qareeb, that deliverance is near. And I hope and pray that deliverance is near for him and all the other prisoners there too. If you'd like to know more about Fayez Al-Kandari's case, you can visit Facebook page Free Fayez and Fawzi. I would like to thank my guests, the production staff, and you at home for watching. See you again in 2 weeks, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.